I moved to Millbrook because I wanted to disappear. After my divorce, losing my house, and watching my entire life fall apart, I needed a fresh start somewhere no one knew me. Millbrook seemed perfect, a tiny town with 2 stoplights, 1 grocery store, and rent I could actually afford. But from the moment I arrived, something felt wrong. When I picked up the keys to my apartment, my landlord kept staring at me. He finally asked if we had met before. I told him I'd never been to Millbrook in my life, but he kept looking at me like he was trying to remember something. Over the next week, the same thing happened everywhere I went. The grocery store cashier welcomed me back before realizing I wasn't who she thought I was. The coffee shop owner looked nervous while handing me my change. Even a group of teenagers crossed the street to avoid me, staring back with fear. It wasn't just that people thought they recognized me. It was the fear in their eyes that disturbed me. Eventually, I asked Carl, the elderly owner of the hardware store, why everyone kept reacting that way. He studied my face for a long moment before saying, "You really don't know who you look like?" When I admitted I didn't, he simply shook his head and said it wasn't his place to tell me. That night, I called my mother to ask if we'd ever visited Millbrook. She said she'd never even heard of the town, but when I mentioned it to my aunt, she suddenly went silent. After I told her I had moved there, she hung up. Later, she sent me a single text message. "Get out of that town. Asterisk, asterisk, I should have listened." But instead, my curiosity only grew stronger. At the bank, the teller turned pale the moment she saw me. She called the manager, who asked for extra identification while glancing at something behind the counter. Before she could hide it, I noticed a blurry photograph taped to the wall. The woman in the picture looked exactly like me. When I asked about it, the manager quickly covered the photo and claimed it was just security protocol. I went straight to the library hoping to find old newspaper archives, but they were suddenly unavailable. As I was leaving, the librarian quietly whispered 2 words, February 2019. Asterisk, asterisk, I spent hours searching online, but every article, every news report, and every mention of whatever happened had been erased. It was as if someone had wiped the entire event from the internet. A week later, I came home and found my apartment door open. Nothing had been stolen, but everything had been moved. My photo albums were rearranged, and my laptop had clearly been searched. Someone was trying to figure out who I was. The strange experiences didn't stop there. I began dreaming about a house I'd never seen, with yellow curtains and the smell of smoke filling the air. Every morning, I woke up feeling like I had forgotten something important. Then everything changed. At the old cemetery on the edge of town, I found a grave with fresh flowers. The name on the headstone had been deliberately scratched away. Only one date remained, February 15th, 2019. Behind the grave was a small framed photograph. The moment I picked it up, my blood ran cold. The woman in the picture was me. She had my face, my eyes, and even the small scar above my left eyebrow from when I fell as a child. The only difference was that she wore clothes I'd never owned and stood in front of a house I'd never seen. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. Half the town was standing behind me. Carl slowly walked forward and quietly said, "We always knew you'd come back." My hands shook as I held up the photograph. "That's not me," I said. "I've never been here before." Carl nodded. Her name was Eleanor Price. She lived here for 3 years, kept to herself, and seemed like a good person. Then one night, in February 2019, she set fire to the community center during the town's winter fundraiser. 14 people died. Before anyone could stop her, she disappeared. I could barely breathe. "I'm not Eleanor." "We know," the librarian said as she stepped forward. "We spent weeks checking your records, your history, and your identity. You're not her." "Then why has everyone been treating me like this?" I asked. "Because we had to be sure," Carl answered quietly. "And because some people in this town will never believe you're someone else. Every time they look at you, they'll only see her face." One by one, the crowd quietly walked away until only Carl remained. He looked at me with genuine sympathy before saying one final thing. "You should leave. This version keeps every major event and twist while making the narration smoother, more natural, and easier to follow. It's not because we'll hurt you," Carl said quietly. "It's because this town will never let you be anyone except her ghost. You'll spend the rest of your life living as someone else's nightmare." I left Millbrook the very next morning without looking back. But leaving the town didn't mean I escaped it. Even now, I still dream about that house with the yellow curtains. Sometimes I wake up, look into the mirror, and for a split second, I don't recognize my own reflection. It makes me wonder if identity is really something we're born with, or if it's something other people force onto us because they need us to fit a certain story. I often think about Eleanor Price, whoever she truly was. I wonder if she ever felt trapped inside someone else's version of herself. Sometimes I even wonder if that's what drove her to burn everything down. I drove for 6 straight hours, putting as much distance as possible between myself and Millbrook until the town started to feel like a nightmare I'd imagined. My hands never stopped shaking on the steering wheel. Every time I looked into the rearview mirror, I expected to see Carl's exhausted face or the crowd from the cemetery following behind me. The words kept echoing in my mind. 14 people died. She burned down the community center. Twice I had to pull off the highway because my vision became too blurry to drive. The second time, I sat in a gas station parking lot for nearly 20 minutes while my heart raced and I struggled to catch my breath. A woman filling her car with gas looked at me through my window. I immediately started the engine and drove away. By the time I crossed into the next state, and then another, the sun was beginning to set. My back ached from gripping the steering wheel so tightly for hours. Eventually, I found a small motel on the edge of a city large enough that none of the stores looked familiar. The front desk clerk barely glanced at me as I paid cash for 3 nights. The room smelled of old cigarettes mixed with harsh cleaning chemicals, but none of that mattered. Nobody here knew about Eleanor Price. Nobody knew about February 2019. Nobody knew about the fire at the community center. I locked the door, checked it twice, then collapsed onto the bed without even taking off my shoes. For the next 3 days, I barely left the room. I only opened the door long enough to collect food after delivery drivers knocked and left the bags outside. I deliberately ordered from different restaurants every time so nobody would notice a routine. My laptop stayed open on the small desk from morning until night. Search after search filled the screen. I typed Eleanor Price into every search engine I could find. Nothing. Then I searched Eleanor Price Millbrook. Asterisk, asterisk, the only results were a dentist in California and a high school teacher in Maine. Neither was the woman I was looking for. Next, I searched February 2019 Community Center fire. Result appeared for fires in different states, different towns, and different years, but nothing connected to Millbrook. I kept trying new combinations. Arson. 14 victims. Winter fundraiser. Nothing. It was as if someone had completely erased Eleanor Price from the internet. I moved on to archived newspaper websites and public record databases, searching by dates, locations, and every keyword I could think of. Hours slipped by while I clicked through endless pages that led nowhere. My eyes burned from staring at the screen. At one point, I ordered coffee from a cafe down the street, but I became so absorbed in searching that I forgot about it until it had gone completely cold. Then I turned to social media. I created fake accounts so I could search for Eleanor Price, anyone who might have known her, or anyone who had ever mentioned her. I found 3 women with that name on one platform, 2 on another. None of them matched her age or location. Then I searched for Millbrook community groups, local pages, and neighborhood forums. The town had a Facebook group with only 42 members. The newest post was 6 months old and advertised a bake sale. I kept scrolling through older posts. Potluck dinners, school events, road construction updates. Not one single mention of Eleanor Price. Not one mention of the fire. Not even February 2019. It was almost as if the entire town had made a silent agreement to erase the past. On the 4th day, I finally called my aunt. The phone rang 4 times before she answered. When she said my name, her voice sounded tense, almost frightened. I told her I'd done exactly what she wanted. I'd left Millbrook. The relief in her voice was so obvious I could hear it immediately. She asked if I was safe, where I was staying, and whether anyone had followed me. I assured her I was fine, far away, and that nobody knew where I'd gone. Then I asked the question that had been haunting me. Why did you tell me to leave? What does our family have to do with Millbrook? Why were you so terrified when I mentioned that town? She didn't answer. I could only hear her breathing. 30 seconds passed. then a full minute. I was about to ask if she'd hung up when she finally spoke. "This isn't something I can explain over the phone," she said quietly. She told me to come see her in person. She said there were things I needed to see with my own eyes before she could explain everything. I asked what those things were. She refused to say another word. Instead, she promised she'd tell me everything once I arrived. Then she gave me her address, even though I already knew it, and urged me to come as soon as possible. I packed my bag, checked out of the motel, and headed for my car. The drive to my aunt's house took about 3 hours, winding through quiet back roads and small towns. I'd only been there twice before, both visits during family holidays when I was younger. She lived in a modest ranch-style house with a neatly trimmed lawn and colorful flower beds lining the front walkway. I parked in the driveway, but stayed in the car for a minute, trying to prepare myself for whatever she was about to tell me. When I finally walked to the front door and knocked, she opened it immediately, as if she'd been standing there waiting for me. The moment she saw my face, all the color drained from hers. She stared at me the same way the people in Millbrook had, as if I were someone else hiding behind my own face. Slowly, she reached out with trembling fingers and gently touched my cheek. Without saying a word, she pulled me inside and quickly locked the door behind us. She led me into the kitchen in complete silence. Her hands shook as she filled a kettle with water and placed it on the stove. As I sat down at the kitchen table, something immediately caught my attention. The entire table was covered with newspaper clippings. There were dozens of them. Some had yellowed with age, while others looked much newer. I leaned closer and noticed dates from the 1970s, headlines mentioning Millbrook, and old photographs of people I had never seen before. My aunt placed 2 mugs on the counter before turning to face me. She looked older than I remembered, or maybe she just looked exhausted. Finally, she took a deep breath. "There's something about our family's history that you need to know," she said. "I only discovered it last year, and I've been trying to make sense of it ever since." She sat across from me and began explaining everything. The year before, she'd become interested in genealogy after taking one of those DNA ancestry tests that helps map your family tree. She started researching our grandmother's side of the family, digging through old census records, birth certificates, and newspaper archives. That's when she found something unexpected. An old newspaper from Millbrook dated 1974 mentioned that our grandmother had a younger sister, a sister no one in our family had ever talked about. According to the article, that sister had married a man from Millbrook and moved there in the early 1970s. My aunt handed me the faded newspaper clipping. It was a wedding announcement. The ink had faded over the years, making most of the text difficult to read, but I could still make out the names, the date, and the town. She explained that our family had completely lost contact with that sister decades ago. No one knew what happened to her. No one knew why she suddenly disappeared from family gatherings, holiday cards, or even family conversations. When my aunt asked my mother about her, my mother had no memory of ever hearing about a great-aunt or our grandmother's missing sister. It was as though that entire branch of our family had been erased from history. Then my aunt pulled another item from the pile. It was an old photograph. The entire table was covered with newspaper clippings. There were dozens of them. Some had yellowed with age, while others looked much newer. I leaned closer and noticed dates from the 1970s, headlines mentioning Millbrook, and old photographs of people I had never seen before. My aunt placed 2 mugs on the counter before turning to face me. She looked older than I remembered, or maybe she just looked exhausted. Finally, she took a deep breath. "There's something about our family's history that you need to know," she said. "I only discovered it last year, and I've been trying to make sense of it ever since." She sat across from me and began explaining everything. The year before, she'd become interested in genealogy after taking one of those DNA ancestry tests that helps map your family tree. She started researching our grandmother's side of the family, digging through old census records, birth certificates, and newspaper archives. That's when she found something unexpected. An old newspaper from Millbrook dated 1974 mentioned that our grandmother had a younger sister, a sister no one in our family had ever talked about. According to the article, that sister had married a man from Millbrook and moved there in the early 1970s. My aunt handed me the faded newspaper clipping. It was a wedding announcement. The ink had faded over the years, making most of the text difficult to read, but I could still make out the names, the date, and the town. She explained that our family had completely lost contact with that sister decades ago. No one knew what happened to her. No one knew why she suddenly disappeared from family gatherings, holiday cards, or even family conversations. When my aunt asked my mother about her, my mother had no memory of ever hearing about a great-aunt or our grandmother's missing sister. It was as though that entire branch of our family had been erased from history. Then my aunt pulled another item from the pile. It was an old photograph. The picture was grainy and badly faded, with 1978 written in pencil on the back. A woman stood smiling in front of a house. She looked exactly like my grandmother. The same nose, the same eyes. Even the way she stood was identical. My aunt pointed to the photo and quietly said, "This is what made me keep digging." Then she showed me another photograph. This one was of my grandmother from around the same time. The resemblance was unbelievable. The two sisters looked almost like identical twins, even though they had been born 5 years apart. She explained that the women in our family shared unusually strong facial features. The same bone structure, eyes, and expressions kept appearing generation after generation, in daughters, granddaughters, nieces, and cousins. She even showed me an old picture of herself from the 1980s. I saw it instantly. It was the same face, the same features staring back at me from 3 different generations. After discovering that, my aunt became obsessed with tracking down the missing side of our family. For months, she searched through public records, old phone books, property records, and family documents. She contacted distant relatives and followed every lead she could find. Eventually, she learned that our grandmother's sister and her husband had left Millbrook in 2003. They had moved to another state. After that, their trail simply disappeared. But my aunt refused to give up. Eventually, she found a distant second cousin, a descendant from the husband's side of the family. She called the cousin and asked about Millbrook and the missing relatives. The conversation ended almost immediately. The cousin refused to discuss the town. Instead, she warned my aunt to stop looking into Millbrook's past. She said some things were better left buried. Then she hung up. My aunt tried calling again several times, but her number had already been blocked. That happened 6 months earlier. Since then, she'd been struggling to decide whether she should continue searching or simply let the mystery go. Then I called and told her I'd moved to Millbrook. She looked me straight in the eyes. I panicked, she admitted. By then, I'd already learned enough to know that something terrible had happened in that town. Something somehow connected to our family. She explained that she didn't know anything about Eleanor Price, the fire, or the 14 people who died. She only knew Millbrook had a dark history, and that women with faces like ours somehow seemed connected to it. That's why she'd begged me to leave. That's why she'd hung up and immediately texted me to get out of town. She was terrified that living in a place filled with painful memories attached to a face I had inherited through no choice of my own would put me in danger. Without saying anything, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My hands trembled as I opened the photograph I'd taken at Eleanor's grave. Then I slowly turned the screen toward my aunt. If you want, I can continue rewriting the next part in the exact same style, so the entire story remains consistent. My aunt leaned closer to the phone, squinting at the picture at first. Then all the color drained from her face. She slowly set her teacup onto the saucer, and it rattled in her shaking hands. One hand covered her mouth as she stared at the photograph for what felt like an entire minute without saying a single word. Finally, she picked up her own phone and began scrolling through old files. Her fingers trembled so badly that she struggled to tap the screen. After a few moments, she found what she was looking for. It was a blurry screenshot she had saved 6 months earlier. The image quality was terrible, as if someone had zoomed in from a great distance, but I could still make out the woman standing in front of what looked like a post office. It was Eleanor. My aunt quietly explained that this was the only photograph she'd managed to find online before everything connected to Eleanor had been erased from the internet. She had saved it because she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "The resemblance isn't just strong," she whispered. "It's impossible to explain. She looked back and forth between the two photos. We look exactly alike, right down to details that shouldn't exist in two completely unrelated people. She spread all of her genealogy research across the kitchen table, and for the next 4 hours we went through every document together. There were birth certificates, census records, marriage licenses, death certificates, even immigration papers dating back 3 generations. My aunt had been incredibly thorough, tracing every branch of our family tree with dates, locations, and official records. But no matter how carefully we searched, there wasn't a single connection to Eleanor Price. No shared ancestors, no secret adoptions, no missing relatives, no family members who had ever moved to Millbrook or had any known connection to the town. According to every document we could find, Eleanor's recorded history began 6 years earlier when she arrived in Millbrook, 3 years before the fire. Before that, nothing. Her past was completely blank. My aunt showed me where she tried to trace Eleanor's history through employment records, rental agreements, and property records, but every trail ended in 2016. It was almost as if Eleanor had simply appeared out of nowhere, already an adult, already using that name, with no history that anyone could uncover. My aunt leaned back in her chair and rubbed her tired eyes. Eventually, she suggested one possible explanation. Maybe Eleanor really was part of our extended family. Maybe she came from a distant branch no one stayed in contact with. Perhaps she'd been adopted, or maybe someone had been cut off from the family decades ago, which would explain why nobody recognized her name, even if the family resemblance had survived through generations. It would explain why you look so much alike, my aunt said. These facial features run incredibly strong in our bloodline. But even as she spoke, I could tell she didn't fully believe her own theory. It didn't explain why Eleanor had chosen Millbrook if she really had family ties somewhere else. And it certainly didn't explain what could make someone pour accelerant around the exits of a community center, trap 14 people inside, and burn them alive. When my aunt said those words, her voice dropped to almost a whisper, as though speaking more quietly could somehow make the horror easier to bear. I left just before sunset with a thick folder of copied documents tucked under my arm. My aunt walked me to my car and hugged me much longer than usual. She told me to be careful. She told me to call if I needed anything. I could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that had made her hang up the phone and text me to leave Millbrook immediately. She was afraid I was going to disappear into this mystery the same way Eleanor had disappeared into whatever darkness had consumed her. But I couldn't walk away. If Eleanor looked exactly like me, if we shared the same face that the people of Millbrook would never forget, then understanding who she was felt like the only way I'd ever understand why any of this had happened to me. Maybe it wouldn't change anything, but I needed to know who Eleanor really was. And I needed to know what had broken inside her. 2 hours later, I arrived in a city I'd never visited before. It was far enough from Millbrook that no one would recognize my face or connect me to Eleanor's crimes. The public library there was old and quiet, with high ceilings and rows of wooden card catalogs still mounted along the walls, even though everything had long since become digital. I walked up to the reference desk and asked about requesting newspaper archives from nearby counties through interlibrary loan. The librarian, an older man wearing reading glasses attached to a chain, calmly explained the process without asking why I needed them. I filled out request forms for newspapers from 3 towns surrounding Millbrook, covering February and March of 2019. Millbrook may have erased its own history, but something as devastating as a mass casualty fire would almost certainly have made front-page news in neighboring communities. The librarian told me it would take several weeks for the microfilm to arrive from storage facilities and other libraries. I thanked him, left my contact information, and walked back outside. The rest of the afternoon, I sat alone in my car, trying to figure out what to do while I waited. 3 weeks suddenly felt like 3 months. Eventually, I found a cheap apartment in the same city as the library and decided to stay there until the archives arrived. To cover my expenses, I found a temporary remote job doing data entry while I waited for the library archives to arrive. Every few days, I called the library to check if the newspaper reels had come in. Finally, on a Tuesday morning, the librarian called and told me the microfilm had arrived. I was there within an hour. He led me to one of the old microfilm readers tucked away in a quiet corner of the library. After showing me how to load the film and adjust the focus, he left me alone with stacks of archived newspapers for February 2019. I started scrolling through edition after edition. Most of it was ordinary small-town news, school board meetings, high school basketball games, obituaries for people who had passed away peacefully. Then I found it, February 17th, 2019, 2 days after the fire. The headline stretched across nearly half the front page. 14 dead in Millbrook Community Center arson. Asterisk asterisk beneath, it was a photograph of the community center, or what remained of it. The building was nothing but a burned-out shell. The roof had collapsed. The walls were blackened with smoke, and firefighters surrounded the ruins, still spraying water onto the remaining hot spots. The article explained that the fire had started around 8 p.m. on Friday, February 15th, during the town's annual winter fundraiser. The community center had been packed with families. Around 150 people were there. Children were running around while their parents bid on silent auction items and enjoyed donated food. According to investigators, someone had poured accelerant around the main exits before setting it on fire. Within minutes, the doorways became walls of flames. People tried desperately to escape through the windows, but several of them had been locked or blocked. Investigators concluded it was a deliberate act of arson carried out with the clear intention of trapping people inside. The suspect was identified as Eleanor Price through security camera footage and witness statements. But before police could arrest her, she vanished. I kept scrolling until I reached another article on the following page. This one focused entirely on Eleanor herself. It described her as a quiet resident who had lived in Millbrook for 3 years. She worked remotely as a graphic designer. She kept to herself. She always paid her rent on time. She had never caused any trouble. The article quoted several neighbors who sounded completely shocked. One woman said, "Eleanor seemed perfectly normal. She always said hello and sometimes even brought cookies to neighborhood gatherings." Another neighbor remembered how Eleanor had once helped carry his groceries while he was recovering from surgery. No one suspected anything was wrong. There had been no warning signs, no arguments, no conflicts with anyone in town, no known history of mental illness or violent behavior. She had simply lived a quiet, ordinary life. Until she didn't. A newspaper from March 2019 revealed what happened after the fire. Eleanor's body had been found in a wooded area about 15 miles outside Millbrook. She had died from exposure and hypothermia. After setting the fire, she had fled into the wilderness and survived only 3 more days. Authorities concluded that she chose to disappear rather than face justice for what she'd done. The article included a statement from the sheriff. He said they would have preferred to capture her alive so the victims' families could finally get answers. Still, he hoped knowing she was dead would bring them some sense of closure. I stared at that word. Closure. I couldn't help wondering if anyone in Millbrook truly felt that way. Another article listed the names of all 14 victims. I read every single one. The Brennan family, a mother, father, and their 2 children, ages 6 and 11. Martha Lim, 73, the volunteer coordinator. Robert Hayes, 61, the town's fire chief, who died while trying to evacuate people. Jennifer and Michael Oakes, an engaged couple planning their wedding. Each name came with a short description of who they were and what they had been doing that night. By the time I finished reading, my hands were shaking. I felt sick. These were the faces the people of Millbrook remembered every time they looked at me. These were the lives Eleanor had taken. And I was walking around, wearing her face like a mask I could never remove. Suddenly, everything made sense. The coffee shop owner's trembling hands. The teenagers crossing the street to avoid me. Carl telling me the town would never see me as anyone except Eleanor's ghost. I kept scrolling through more newspapers until I found what I had been looking for. Eleanor Price's obituary. It appeared at the bottom of page 12 in a county newspaper about 40 miles away. It was tiny, only a few inches of column space. It simply read, "Born August 3rd, 1987. Died February 18th, 2019, in Millbrook." There were no surviving family members listed, no funeral services, no request for charitable donations instead of flowers. The obituary didn't mention the fire. It didn't mention the 14 victims. It didn't even explain how she died. It simply recorded the basic facts, as though she had lived an ordinary life and passed away like anyone else. The final line only stated that she had died in Millbrook. Nothing more. I took a screenshot of the obituary and saved it in a folder on my phone, a folder that seemed to grow larger every day. Over the following week, I searched everywhere I could think of for any trace of Eleanor's life before Millbrook. Every search engine, every social media platform, every public records database. Nothing. It was as if Eleanor Price had never existed before she arrived in Millbrook. There was nothing. No Facebook profile, no Instagram account, no Twitter presence. I searched for Eleanor's name alongside graphic designer, since that was supposedly her profession. A few people with the same name showed up, but none of them matched her age or location. Then I searched professional directories, freelance websites, and online portfolio platforms. Nothing. I looked through property records, voter registrations, court documents, anything that might reveal where she'd lived before moving to Millbrook 3 years before the fire. The trail went completely cold. It was as if Eleanor Price had never existed until she arrived in that quiet little town, lived there peacefully for 36 months, burned everything down, and disappeared into the woods to die. Every evening after work, I found myself searching for answers. The newspaper articles all said the same thing. Police never found a manifesto. No suicide note. No journal explaining why she did it. Investigators interviewed everyone who knew her and uncovered no history of mental illness, no signs of radicalization, and no personal grudges against anyone in town. According to the sheriff, Eleanor had no obvious motive. It was as if she had simply woken up one February morning and decided to murder her neighbors during a fundraiser where families had brought their children. I started reading true crime forums, looking for cases that resembled hers. Maybe there was a pattern. Some people committed mass violence because they suffered from delusions or claimed to hear voices. Others acted out of revenge, political beliefs, or a desperate need for attention. But Eleanor didn't fit any of those categories. She had planned everything carefully. She brought accelerant. She blocked the exits. Then she disappeared without leaving behind a single explanation. That randomness frightened me even more than if she'd had some twisted reason for what she did. The dreams kept getting worse. Now I woke up 3 or 4 times every night. Every dream took me back to the same room with the yellow curtains. The smell of smoke always filled the air. Sometimes I was standing by a window, watching flames spread outside. Sometimes I was running through endless hallways. Other times I was simply sitting on a bed, feeling absolutely nothing. The dreams felt more real than my own memories. During the day, I caught myself thinking about that mysterious house. I wondered which room it was, why the curtains were yellow, what had happened there. These were my memories, but they were starting to feel like they could be. One morning, I walked into the bathroom, looked in the mirror, and for just a second, I didn't recognize the face staring back at me. For one terrifying moment, it wasn't me. It was Eleanor. I had to grip the sink with both hands and remind myself who I really was. My aunt called one Thursday evening while I was making dinner. As soon as I answered, I started telling her about the obituary I'd found and how Eleanor seemed to have no family and no history before arriving in Millbrook. She interrupted me. "Why are you still researching this?" she asked. "Why haven't you let it go?" I told her I needed to understand what could drive someone to do something so horrific. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "You're talking about Eleanor like you knew her." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "You keep calling her by her first name," she said softly. "You talk about her like she was someone close to you, almost like a friend." I hadn't even realized I was doing that. I tried to explain that I was only trying to understand her. Nothing more. But my aunt sighed. Understanding a monster doesn't mean you have to become one. Then she asked if I was eating properly, sleeping enough, taking care of myself. I lied and answered yes to all 3. After we hung up, I realized something that unsettled me. I'd spent nearly 40 minutes talking about Eleanor, analyzing her choices, trying to solve her life like it was a puzzle that would somehow explain my own. Maybe my aunt had every reason to worry. Not long afterward, I decided I needed to visit the place where Eleanor died. One of the newspaper articles mentioned that her body had been found inside a woodland preserve north of Millbrook, although it never revealed the exact location. I told myself I was looking for closure. Maybe if I stood where she'd spent her final hours, I'd finally understand enough to move on. But deep down, I knew the truth. I simply needed to see it for myself. On a Saturday morning, I drove back toward Millbrook. The closer I got, the tighter my stomach became. When I reached the turnoff for the town, I kept driving north until I saw signs for the preserve. The parking lot was nearly empty. Only 2 other cars were parked there beside a small ranger station at the trailhead. The forest stretched endlessly ahead, with hiking trails marked by colored paint on the trees. Without any real destination, I started walking deeper into the woods. This was where Eleanor had come after setting the fire. She had survived for 3 days before hypothermia claimed her life. 3 days to think about what she'd done. Or maybe 3 days to feel absolutely nothing. I wondered if she had regretted it while walking those same trails. I wondered if she'd felt relief, satisfaction, emptiness. I wondered whether she'd cried, whether she'd screamed, or whether she'd stayed silent until the very end. The trees were so dense that sound barely traveled. Someone could disappear out there for days, maybe even weeks, without anyone ever finding them. Eleanor had chosen this place. She had chosen the wilderness instead of facing what came next. I'd been hiking for about 2 hours when a park ranger appeared on the trail ahead. He looked to be in his 50s and wore the standard ranger uniform. There was concern in his expression as he asked whether I was lost or needed help finding my way back. I assured him I was fine and just out hiking, but he kept studying my face as though trying to remember where he'd seen me before. Wanting to avoid any misunderstanding, I quickly explained that I was researching a historical event. Nothing strange, I said. I'm just trying to understand something that happened here years ago. He nodded slowly. People come looking for that spot sometimes, he said. The place where that woman died back in 2019. He explained that the exact location had never been released to the public. Officials wanted to keep it private so it wouldn't become some kind of morbid tourist attraction. I asked whether he'd been working there when everything happened. He shook his head. His predecessor had handled the investigation, but he'd heard the full story after taking over. According to him, one detail had always stood out. When Eleanor's body was found, she had been carrying survival gear. A tent, a sleeping bag, food, water purification tablets. Everything she would have needed to survive in the wilderness for weeks. She had clearly planned to disappear, but she never used any of it. Every piece of equipment was still packed inside her backpack. Nothing had been opened. Nothing had been unpacked. It was as if she'd carried everything deep into the forest, and then simply given up. What do you mean? I asked. The ranger explained that Eleanor's body had been found only 3 days after the fire. Based on where she was discovered, she'd traveled less than 5 miles into the preserve. She had enough supplies to survive for weeks, maybe even months if she'd been careful. She carried maps, a compass, everything she needed to vanish forever. Yet she never pitched her tent. She never built a camp. She never even tried to use the equipment she'd brought. It was almost like she walked into the woods, the ranger said quietly, found a place away from the trail, sat down, and stopped. Stopped moving. Stopped trying. Stopped everything. She died from exposure during the early spring, when the nights were cold but not deadly if you had shelter and warmth. It looked like she chose to die, the ranger said. Like that was always part of the plan. But if that was her plan, I asked, why bring all the survival gear? He had no answer. I couldn't stop thinking about that detail during the drive back to my motel. Eleanor had carried everything she needed to survive into those woods, yet she never even unpacked her tent. It wasn't exactly suicide. She'd walked miles carrying supplies meant for a long stay. But it wasn't survival either. It felt like she had been following some plan that made sense only to her. By the time I pulled into the motel parking lot, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. And I still had more questions than answers. There was nothing. No Facebook profile. No Instagram account. No Twitter presence. I searched for Eleanor's name alongside graphic designer, since that was supposedly her profession. A few people with the same name showed up, but none of them matched her age or location. Then I searched professional directories, freelance websites, and online portfolio platforms. Nothing. I looked through property records, voter registrations, court documents, anything that might reveal where she'd lived before moving to Millbrook 3 years before the fire. The trail went completely cold. It was as if Eleanor Price had never existed until she arrived in that quiet little town, lived there peacefully for 36 months, burned everything down, and disappeared into the woods to die. Every evening after work, I found myself searching for answers. The newspaper articles all said the same thing. Police never found a manifesto. No suicide note. No journal explaining why she did it. Investigators interviewed everyone who knew her and uncovered no history of mental illness, no signs of radicalization, and no personal grudges against anyone in town. According to the sheriff, Eleanor had no obvious motive. It was as if she had simply woken up one February morning and decided to murder her neighbors during a fundraiser where families had brought their children. I started reading true crime forums, looking for cases that resembled hers. Maybe there was a pattern. Some people committed mass violence because they suffered from delusions or claimed to hear voices. Others acted out of revenge, political beliefs, or a desperate need for attention. But Eleanor didn't fit any of those categories. She had planned everything carefully. She brought accelerant. She blocked the exits. Then she disappeared without leaving behind a single explanation. That randomness frightened me even more than if she'd had some twisted reason for what she did. The dreams kept getting worse. Now I woke up 3 or 4 times every night. Every dream took me back to the same room with the yellow curtains. The smell of smoke always filled the air. Sometimes I was standing by a window, watching flames spread outside. Sometimes I was running through endless hallways. Other times I was simply sitting on a bed, feeling absolutely nothing. The dreams felt more real than my own memories. During the day, I caught myself thinking about that mysterious house. I wondered which room it was, why the curtains were yellow, what had happened there. These were my memories, but they were starting to feel like they could be. One morning, I walked in the bathroom, looked in the mirror, and for just a second, I didn't recognize the face staring back at me. For one terrifying moment, it wasn't me. It was Eleanor. I had to grip the sink with both hands and remind myself who I really was. My aunt called one Thursday evening while I was making dinner. As soon as I answered, I started telling her about the obituary I'd found and how Eleanor seemed to have no family and no history before arriving in Millbrook. She interrupted me. "Why are you still researching this?" she asked. "Why haven't you let it go?" I told her I needed to understand what could drive someone to do something so horrific. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "You're talking about Eleanor like you knew her." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "You keep calling her by her first name," she said softly. "You talk about her like she was someone close to you, almost like a friend." I hadn't even realized I was doing that. I tried to explain that I was only trying to understand her. Nothing more. But my aunt sighed. "Understanding a monster doesn't mean you have to become one." Then she asked if I was eating properly, sleeping enough, taking care of myself. I lied and answered yes to all 3. After we hung up, I realized something that unsettled me. I'd spent nearly 40 minutes talking about Eleanor, analyzing her choices, trying to solve her life like it was a puzzle that would somehow explain my own. Maybe my aunt had every reason to worry. Not long afterward, I decided I needed to visit the place where Eleanor died. One of the newspaper articles mentioned that her body had been found inside a woodland preserve north of Millbrook, although it never revealed the exact location. I told myself I was looking for closure. Maybe if I stood where she'd spent her final hours, I'd finally understand enough to move on. But deep down, I knew the truth. I simply needed to see it for myself. On a Saturday morning, I drove back toward Millbrook. The closer I got, the tighter my stomach became. When I reached the turnoff for the town, I kept driving north until I saw signs for the preserve. The parking lot was nearly empty. Only 2 other cars were parked there beside a small ranger station at the trailhead. The forest stretched endlessly ahead, with hiking trails marked by colored paint on the trees. Without any real destination, I started walking deeper into the woods. This was where Eleanor had come after setting the fire. She had survived for 3 days before hypothermia claimed her life. 3 days to think about what she'd done. Or maybe 3 days to feel absolutely nothing. I wondered if she had regretted it while walking those same trails. I wondered if she'd felt relief, satisfaction, emptiness. I wondered whether she'd cried, whether she'd screamed, or whether she'd stayed silent until the very end. The trees were so dense that sound barely traveled. Someone could disappear out there for days, maybe even weeks without anyone ever finding them. Eleanor had chosen this place. She had chosen the wilderness instead of facing what came next. I'd been hiking for about 2 hours when a park ranger appeared on the trail ahead. He looked to be in his 50s and wore the standard ranger uniform. There was concern in his expression as he asked whether I was lost or needed help finding my way back. I assured him I was fine and just out hiking, but he kept studying my face as though trying to remember where he'd seen me before. Wanting to avoid any misunderstanding, I quickly explained that I was researching a historical event. Nothing strange, I said. I'm just trying to understand something that happened here years ago. He nodded slowly. People come looking for that spot sometimes, he said. The place where that woman died back in 2019. He explained that the exact location had never been released to the public. Officials wanted to keep it private so it wouldn't become some kind of morbid tourist attraction. I asked whether he'd been working there when everything happened. He shook his head. His predecessor had handled the investigation, but he'd heard the full story after taking over. According to him, one detail had always stood out. When Eleanor's body was found, she had been carrying survival gear. A tent, a sleeping bag, food, water purification tablets. Everything she would have needed to survive in the wilderness for weeks. She had clearly planned to disappear, but she never used any of it. Every piece of equipment was still packed inside her backpack. Nothing had been opened. Nothing had been unpacked. It was as if she'd carried everything deep into the forest, and then simply given up. What do you mean? I asked. The ranger explained that Eleanor's body had been found only 3 days after the fire. Based on where she was discovered, she'd traveled less than 5 miles into the preserve. She had enough supplies to survive for weeks, maybe even months if she'd been careful. She carried maps, a compass, everything she needed to vanish forever. Yet she never pitched her tent. She never built a camp. She never even tried to use the equipment she'd brought. It was almost like she walked into the woods. The ranger said quietly, found a place away from the trail, sat down, and stopped. Stopped moving. Stopped trying. Stopped everything. She died from exposure during the early spring, when the nights were cold, but not deadly if you had shelter and warmth. It looked like she chose to die, the ranger said. Like that was always part of the plan. But if that was her plan, I asked, why bring all the survival gear? He had no answer. I couldn't stop thinking about that detail during the drive back to my motel. Eleanor had carried everything she needed to survive into those woods, yet she never even unpacked her tent. It wasn't exactly suicide. She'd walked miles carrying supplies meant for a long stay. But it wasn't survival either. It felt like she had been following some plan that made sense only to her. By the time I pulled into the motel parking lot, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. And I still had more questions than answers. My motel room smelled like old carpet and harsh cleaning chemicals. I spread all my notes across the bed once again. The newspaper articles, the timelines I'd scribbled together, and the photographs I'd printed from the library's microfilm archives. The fire happened on February 15. Eleanor's grave marker said she died on February 18. Exactly 3 days separated the night she burned down the community center from the day she died alone in the woods. I opened my laptop and searched for anything significant about February 15th. Nothing. No historic event. No famous tragedy. No obvious reason that date would have meant anything to someone planning mass murder. I tried different search combinations, looking for similar crimes, other arson cases, or incidents tied to that date. Nothing connected. February 15th had simply been a Friday night in 2019, the night Millbrook held its annual winter fundraiser, and the night Eleanor decided to destroy everything. I read through the list of victims again, even though I already knew every name by heart. 14 people. The youngest was 6 years old. The oldest was 73. Families had gone there to support their community and never made it home. The town's fire chief died trying to rescue others. There was a teacher, a mechanic, a retired nurse, 3 children. Eleanor had known these people. She lived in the same small town. She had probably passed them at the grocery store, smiled at them at the post office, maybe even chatted with them in passing. And despite all of that, she chose to kill them. I checked my bank account. I had only $800 left. I'd spent 3 weeks living in that motel, surviving on gas station sandwiches and instant ramen while doing nothing except researching a dead woman who looked exactly like me. Reality was catching up with me. I needed a job before my money disappeared completely. I needed a real apartment. I needed to start building some kind of normal life again. But every time I told myself to move on, I saw that photograph from Eleanor's grave. The face staring back at me was my own. I couldn't let go until I understood why. Over the next 2 days, I applied for every remote job I could find. Customer service, data entry, virtual assistant positions, anything that would let me work from wherever I ended up. The jobs were repetitive and unremarkable, but they paid enough to survive. During video interviews, I caught myself wondering what the people on the other side of the screen saw when they looked at me. Did they see Eleanor? Did I look like someone capable of setting a building full of innocent people on fire? Was there something hidden in my eyes, something in my expression, that made me resemble a monster? The interviewers smiled politely and asked ordinary questions about my experience and availability. I answered in my most professional voice. All the while, my mind kept drifting back to the woman who shared my face and chose death instead of facing what she'd done. Eventually, one company hired me to answer customer service emails for their online store. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady. They didn't care where I lived as long as I responded to emails within 24 hours. I checked out of the motel and used what little money I had left to rent a tiny studio apartment in a mid-sized city 2 states away from Millbrook. The apartment was small and plain, with white walls and worn-out carpet. But none of that mattered. Nobody there knew who Eleanor Price was. Nobody knew about the community center fire. I could walk down the street without people crossing to the other side. I could buy groceries without seeing fear in the cashier's eyes. For the first time in a long while, I almost felt invisible again. I set up my laptop on the tiny kitchen table and started my new job. Every day, I answered emails about delayed shipments, refund requests, and tracking numbers. The work was repetitive and boring. Exactly what I needed. During the day, I wrote polite responses to customers. At night, I went right back to researching Eleanor. I searched for patterns in her life. I examined every trace of her tiny digital footprint. I looked for anything at all, that might explain what had happened. The months slipped by in the same routine. Work during the day, research at night, sleep only when I was too exhausted to keep my eyes open. My aunt called every Sunday without fail. She always asked the same questions. Was I doing okay? Was I eating enough? Had I made any friends in my new city? I always gave her the same answer. I'm fine. Everything's fine. I'm settling in. I'm moving forward. But she could hear something in my voice that I couldn't hide. She kept telling me I needed to let go of my obsession with Eleanor. That it wasn't healthy to spend every waking hour thinking about a woman who had committed such horrific crimes. Deep down, I knew she was right. But I couldn't stop. I joined online communities dedicated to unsolved mysteries and true crime. I read case studies about people who committed acts of seemingly random violence, hoping that somewhere, somehow, I find a pattern that would finally explain Eleanor Price. I started posting carefully worded questions on true crime forums, asking about perpetrators who committed horrific crimes without any clear motive. I wanted to understand the psychology behind it all without revealing the real reason I was asking, that I shared the same face as one of them. Most people offered the usual explanations: mental illness, childhood trauma, radicalization, but none of those theories matched what I knew about Eleanor. According to every record I had found, she wasn't mentally ill. She had no history of violence, no threats, no warning signs. She had simply lived a quiet life in Millbrook for 3 years. Then one night, she destroyed everything. One evening, A comment on one of the forums made me stop scrolling. The person was discussing criminals who committed terrible acts and then died by suicide almost immediately afterward. They explained that people like that were often acting out an internal story they had created for themselves. The violence wasn't driven by revenge or rage. It was about completing a narrative. Their own death wasn't an escape from punishment. It was the final chapter of the story they believed they had to finish. They planned everything, including the ending, because the ending itself was the point. I read the post once, then again, then a third time. For the first time, something actually seemed to fit Eleanor. She hadn't gone into the woods to survive. She had gone there to finish her story. The fire was the beginning. Her death 3 days later was the ending she'd planned all along. The survival gear suddenly made sense. Someone escaping into the wilderness would naturally carry a tent, food, and supplies. But she had never intended to use any of it. She walked into those woods already knowing she would die there. Her death wasn't an accident. It was part of whatever story she believed she was living. Those 3 days between the fire and her death weren't about hiding from the police or trying to escape. They were about existing in some strange in-between state. She had already completed the terrible thing she'd set out to do. All that remained was the final chapter. After that realization, I shifted my focus to Eleanor's work history. The newspaper articles had mentioned she worked as a graphic designer. Maybe her work would reveal something about who she had been before everything fell apart. I searched through archived websites, old business directories, and every forgotten corner of the internet I could find. After hours of searching, I finally uncovered something. An archived version of a website called EB Price Design appeared in an old web archive. The website was simple. Just a homepage, a portfolio, and a contact page. I opened the portfolio first. Almost immediately, I felt disappointed. Everything looked completely ordinary. Corporate logos for small businesses. Wedding invitation de signes. Brochures for local events. The work was professional, competent, but it felt empty. There was nothing personal about it. No unique artistic style. No creative experiments. No passion projects. It looked like the work of someone simply earning a paycheck instead of expressing themselves. I examined every design, hoping to discover some clue about Eleanor's personality. But there was nothing. The wedding invitations were attractive, but generic. The logos were clean, but forgettable. It felt like the portfolio of someone pretending to be an ordinary small-town designer rather than someone who actually cared about the work. I clicked on the contact page and wrote down everything listed there. There was a post office box in Millbrook that almost certainly no longer existed. A generic email address that had long since gone inactive. Then I noticed something at the bottom of the page. A tiny copyright notice showing the year the website had been created. That gave me an idea. If I could find the domain registration records, I might discover where Eleanor had been living before Millbrook. I searched an archive that stored historical domain registration data and entered the name of her business. When the results appeared, my heart started beating faster. The domain had been registered 8 years earlier. More importantly, the registration listed a physical billing address. It wasn't in Millbrook. It was in a town called Riverside, 3 states away. I stared at the screen, barely believing what I had found. For the first time, I had real evidence that Eleanor had lived somewhere before arriving in Millbrook. I searched Riverside's property records and discovered she had rented a small 1-bedroom apartment there for 2 years before moving. The apartment was located in a modest complex on the edge of town. Nothing expensive, nothing unusual, just another quiet place. I kept digging. Eventually, I uncovered an even older address. Before Riverside, Eleanor had rented another apartment in a town called Greenfield in yet another state. I spent the rest of the night tracing her movements backward through rental records, archived utility bills, and every public database I could access. A clear pattern began to emerge. Every 2 or 3 years, she moved. Always to another small town. Always somewhere quiet that few people had ever heard of. She kept an incredibly low profile. No social media. No community involvement. No lasting connections. 2 years in Riverside. 3 years in Millbrook. Before Riverside. 2 years in Greenfield. Before Riverside, she had lived in a town called Ashton for almost 3 years. I mapped every address I'd found, spreading them across the country, hoping a pattern would appear. There wasn't one. The only thing the towns had in common was that they were all small, quiet places. It looked as though Eleanor had spent years either running from something or searching for something. Every few years, she packed up, disappeared, and started over somewhere new, as if she was trying to stay one step ahead of whatever was chasing her. The pattern stretched back nearly 10 years before Millbrook. That meant she'd spent an entire decade drifting from one small town to another without ever putting down permanent roots. I tried digging further back than Ashton, searching for anything from before that first address 12 years earlier. There was nothing. No college records. No childhood address. No family history. No trace of her at all. According to every official record I could find, Eleanor Price simply appeared 12 years earlier when she was in her late 20s. Before that, she was invisible. It was as if she had never existed or had been living under an entirely different name. I leaned back from my laptop, exhausted and overwhelmed. The fire in Millbrook no longer felt like the random act of a disturbed woman. Eleanor had been running for years, moving every few years, never staying anywhere long enough to build a real life. Whatever she'd been trying to escape had finally caught up with her in Millbrook, and that's where everything ended. The fire wasn't the beginning. It was the final chapter of a story that had started years earlier. I realized I couldn't dig any deeper on my own. If I wanted answers, I needed professional help. I searched online for private investigators and eventually found one who specialized in background investigations and historical research. Even though it was late, I called the number. A man answered. He sounded tired but professional. I explained that I was trying to research someone's life before they started using a particular name. There was a long silence. Finally, he asked why I wanted the information. I told him a version of the truth. I said I was trying to understand someone who had committed a terrible crime and that I believed their past held the answers. He was skeptical at first, but after I explained everything I'd already uncovered and everything I still couldn't explain, he agreed to take the case. The fee was far more than I could comfortably afford. Still, I gave him my credit card information without hesitating. At that point, I needed answers more than I needed money. I emailed him everything I'd collected, every address, every timeline, every newspaper clipping, every piece of information connected to Eleanor. He told me he'd search for birth records, school records, and anything that might exist before Eleanor began moving from town to town. He also warned me that it could take several weeks. And if Eleanor had been living under an assumed identity, he might never find anything at all. I told him to search anyway. The following weeks were painfully slow. During the day, I answered customer service emails for work, but my thoughts were always somewhere else. Always on Eleanor. Always wondering what the investigator might uncover. I checked my email constantly, hoping for an update. My aunt called every few days to see how I was doing. I could hear the concern in her voice every time I admitted I was still researching Eleanor's past. She thought I was getting too consumed by it, that I was slowly disappearing into someone else's story. Maybe she was right, but I couldn't stop now. 6 weeks after hiring him, the investigator finally sent me his report. My hands shook as I opened the attachment. I read every page carefully. There was almost nothing. According to his investigation, Eleanor Price first appeared in official records 12 years earlier when she applied for a driver's license in Ashton using that name. Before that, nothing. No birth certificate, no school records, no previous addresses, nothing connected to the name Eleanor Price. The investigator concluded that Eleanor Price was almost certainly an assumed identity. The woman I knew as Eleanor had probably lived under another name before arriving in Ashton. He outlined several possible explanations. She might have entered a witness protection program and been given a new identity. She might have been escaping an abusive relationship and changed her name to disappear. Or she might have had a criminal past and created a new identity to start over somewhere else. Any of those possibilities could explain why she changed her name and spent years moving from one quiet town to another. They might even explain why she eventually suffered some kind of psychological collapse that ended in such horrific violence. But there was no way to prove any of it. Without help from government agencies, the truth would remain hidden, and no agency was going to reopen an old case involving someone who had been dead for years. I read the report 3 separate times, hoping I'd overlooked something, anything, but the investigator had done his job thoroughly. Eleanor's life before Ashton simply didn't exist anymore. Whether it had been erased or hidden, no one could tell. I paid his final invoice, closed my laptop, and sat quietly in my tiny studio apartment. I felt completely defeated. After months of searching, I was right back where I'd started. More questions, no real answers. The only thing I knew for certain was this. Eleanor Price had spent years running from something. She eventually arrived in Millbrook wearing the same face I had. And somewhere along the way, whatever had been chasing her finally caught up. When it did, she destroyed herself and took 14 innocent people with her. I closed the investigator's report and stared silently at the wall for what felt like hours. Eleanor Price's past was a dead end, a locked door that led nowhere. I'd spent thousands of dollars. I couldn't really afford chasing the life of a ghost who seemed determined never to be found. The investigator's theories kept replaying in my mind. Witness protection, an abusive relationship, a criminal past. Each explanation sounded possible, yet none of them explained anything. I could invent endless stories about who Eleanor had been before she became Eleanor Price. But in the end, that's all they were. Stories I told myself to fill the empty spaces. The truth is, Eleanor took her reasons to the grave along with 14 innocent people. No amount of research, money, or obsession was ever going to bring those answers back. 3 days later, my aunt showed up without warning. She used the spare key I'd given her for emergencies. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I was still wearing my pajamas. My apartment was covered with printed documents, handwritten timelines, photographs, and newspaper clippings spread across every available surface. She stood in the doorway, slowly taking it all in. Her face turned pale as she realized just how consumed I'd become. At first, she didn't say anything. She simply walked into the kitchen and started making tea, just like she used to when I was a kid and needed comforting. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but firm. She asked me when I'd last eaten a proper meal, when I'd last gone outside, when I'd last spoken to someone who wasn't connected to Eleanor Price. I told her I'd eaten yesterday. The truth was, I couldn't even remember what I'd eaten. She looked at me in a way that made it obvious she knew I wasn't telling the truth. Then she sat down on the couch, the only place in the apartment that wasn't buried under research papers, and patted the seat beside her. "You look terrible," she said gently. "You've lost weight you couldn't afford to lose. Your skin is pale. You have dark circles under your eyes. You haven't been sleeping." She was right. I knew she was. But somehow, I couldn't bring myself to care about my own health while there were still unanswered questions about Eleanor. My aunt picked up one of my timelines. She studied the dates, the towns, and the 12 years of Eleanor's movements before carefully setting it back down, almost as if it might fall apart. Then she looked at me. "What do you think you're going to find?" she asked. "What answer could possibly make sacrificing your own life worth it?" I didn't have an answer. She quietly told me that I had to let this go. Some questions never get answered. That's simply how life works sometimes. I couldn't spend the rest of my life trying to understand a woman who had burned innocent people alive. I try to explain. It isn't that simple. Eleanor's face is my face. Everywhere I go, people will see what she did when they look at me. The only way I can separate myself from her is to understand why she did it. My aunt's eyes filled with tears. She reached across the couch and took my hand, holding it tightly between both of hers. "You came here after your divorce looking for a fresh start," she said softly. "Instead, you've disappeared into someone else's story." She told me she'd watched me lose myself in this obsession the same way Eleanor disappeared into those woods. She was terrified that I wasn't going to find my way back. Then she begged me to see a therapist, to talk to someone who could help me process everything that had happened in Millbrook. I wanted to argue. I really did. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I looked around my apartment through her eyes. The walls covered with newspaper clippings, the timelines, the photographs, the endless stacks of research. Somehow, I turned my home into a shrine dedicated to a murderer. For the first time, I realized she might be right. I'd become so focused on understanding Eleanor that I'd stopped taking care of myself. I'd stopped thinking about my own future. I'd stopped being my own person. That night, after my aunt left, promising to call every single day to check on me, I had the dream about the yellow curtains again. But this time it was different, more vivid than ever before. I was standing inside a child's bedroom. Warm sunlight poured through soft yellow curtains. There was a small bed covered with a patchwork quilt. Toys were scattered across the floor. At first, the room felt peaceful, safe, comfortable. Then everything changed. A feeling of fear settled over me so suddenly that my chest tightened. I heard slow, heavy footsteps in the hallway outside. The doorknob began to turn, very slowly. I wanted to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The fear was overwhelming. It felt like I was drowning. Then I smelled smoke. Thick, heavy, choking smoke. I woke up gasping for air in my own bed, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst through my chest. The smell of smoke still lingered, even though nothing was burning. My hand shook uncontrollably. My clothes were soaked with sweat. For a few terrifying seconds, I couldn't remember who I was, or where I was. The dream had felt so real. Not like a dream at all, like a memory. I found myself wondering if somehow, it had been Eleanor's memory. As impossible as that sounded, I couldn't shake the feeling. The child's bedroom, the fear, the smoke, they all felt like fragments of her past trying to tell me something. I got out of bed and immediately wrote down everything I could remember, adding the notes to the growing pile of research. Deep down, I knew how irrational it sounded. I knew I was projecting, creating false memories because of stress, trauma, and obsession. My rational mind understood that dreams were only dreams. Then my subconscious was trying to process the horror of being mistaken for a murderer. It was creating vivid scenes to make sense of something that had no logical explanation. Of course, every dream ended with smoke. Eleanor's story ended with fire, with death, with destruction. My brain was simply trying to work through the terror of sharing her face. But understanding that didn't make the dreams feel any less real. It didn't stop me from waking up with the smell of smoke in my nose, or the taste of fear in my mouth. It was as if my subconscious was desperately trying to tell me something about fire, about fear, about escape, something I still couldn't understand. I spent the rest of the night sitting alone at my kitchen table, staring at the mountain of research spread around me, wondering if I was slowly losing my mind. 3 days later, I finally admitted I needed help. I made an appointment with a therapist. Her office was inside a plain medical building with beige walls and generic landscape paintings hanging in the hallways. I sat quietly in the waiting room, filling out forms about my mental health history. When a therapist came to get me, she was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm, reassuring voice. The moment she greeted me, I felt like crying. Once we sat down, I told her everything. From a moment, I moved to Millbrook, to everyone mistaking me for Eleanor, to finding the grave, the town's reaction, and the obsession that had completely taken over my life afterward. She listened without interrupting, only stopping occasionally to write a few notes. When I finally finished, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me thoughtfully. "What happened to you in Millbrook was deeply traumatic," she said. "You were forced to carry the face of someone who committed terrible crimes. Your mind is trying to protect itself by understanding Eleanor, hoping that if you can explain her, you'll somehow separate yourself from her." She explained that what I was experiencing was a trauma response. My brain had become obsessed with researching Eleanor because it was trying to make sense of something that felt impossible. "The research gives you a sense of control," she said, "but it's also keeping you trapped inside the trauma instead of allowing you to heal." She told me that what I really needed wasn't more answers about Eleanor. I needed to rebuild my own identity, to focus on my own life instead of a dead woman's past, to move forward instead of constantly looking backward. Part of me wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her she didn't understand how important it was for me to know why Eleanor had done what she did. But something about her calm expression stopped me. Instead, she asked me a simple question. "What do you think will change if you finally understand Eleanor?" I opened my mouth and realized I didn't have an answer. Over the next several weeks of therapy, I slowly began to understand something I hadn't wanted to admit. My obsession with Eleanor wasn't really about Eleanor. It was about me. The divorce had shattered my identity. Somewhere during my marriage, I'd lost myself. By the time it ended, I barely recognized the person I'd become. Then everything else collapsed. The house, my finances, my confidence. I felt powerless, ashamed, like I'd failed at adulthood. Moving to Millbrook was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where nobody knew who I was or what I'd been through. Instead, I found Eleanor, and somehow, her story became more important than my own. My therapist helped me see that focusing on Eleanor gave me something outside myself to fixate on. A mystery felt easier to solve than my own grief. It was easier to investigate a dead woman's crimes than to face my own pain, loss, and fear about the future. Slowly, I began the difficult process of separating her story from mine. Yes, we shared a face, but that was all we shared. We were not the same person. My therapist gave me exercises to practice whenever my thoughts drifted back to Eleanor. She taught me grounding techniques, ways to remind myself who I really was. She kept repeating the same truth. I don't need to understand Eleanor to reclaim my own life. Her choices, her crimes, her death, none of them define me. The work was harder than any investigation I'd ever done, because instead of chasing clues, I had to sit with emotions I'd spent months avoiding. I had to grieve my divorce, accept my financial struggles, face the fear of building a completely new life. My therapist also helped me accept something I had fought against for months. Some mysteries simply don't have answers, and that's okay. Eleanor carried her reasons into the grave when she died in those woods. I could choose to let them stay there instead of sacrificing my own mental health, trying to uncover something that no longer existed. One day, she asked me another question. If you weren't spending all this time researching Eleanor, what would you do instead? What kind of life do you want to build? I sat there quietly. For the first time in months, I realized I hadn't thought about my own future at all. I'd spent so much time living inside Eleanor's past that I'd forgotten I still had a present and a future that belonged only to me. The following Saturday morning, I packed away every piece of research, every newspaper clipping, every photograph, every timeline, every note. I carefully placed them into cardboard boxes. I wasn't ready to throw them away. Not yet, but I sealed each box with tape and carried them to a storage unit I'd rented for exactly this purpose. The moment those boxes left my apartment, it felt like I could finally breathe again. I hadn't realized how heavy they were until they were gone. When I came home, the walls were empty. The tables were clear. For the first time in months, my apartment felt like mine again, not a shrine to someone else's tragedy. I stood quietly in the middle of the living room, and I felt lighter than I had in a very long time. A few days later, I joined a book club at the local library. They met every Tuesday evening and mostly read mystery and thriller novels. At my first meeting, nobody stared at me. Nobody whispered. Nobody looked afraid. Someone simply handed me a copy of the month's book and asked if I wanted a cup of coffee. A week later, I signed up for a pottery class at the community center. The instructor patiently showed me how to center clay on the wheel. She never asked where I came from. She never said I looked familiar. Those ordinary moments felt strange at first. I kept expecting someone to recognize me, to mistake me for someone else. But nobody ever did. Week after week, I became just another member of the class. The woman whose bowls always came out a little crooked. The one who laughed at her own mistakes. At book club, I became friends with a woman named Lisa. We met for coffee after meetings and talked about our favorite authors, terrible exes, and everyday life. At pottery class, I chatted with classmates about weekend plans, restaurants, and movies. Simple conversations. Normal conversations. Conversations where I never had to explain myself. Never had to defend who I was. Never had to prove I wasn't someone else. Little by little, those ordinary moments reminded me what it felt like to simply exist as myself. I started going to the farmer's market every Saturday morning. The vendor smiled, asked how my week had been, and chatted about the weather while I bought fresh vegetables. I joined a gym, Started taking yoga classes. The instructor learned my name. Nobody asked about scars. Nobody mentioned resemblance. Nobody looked frightened when they saw my face. Those simple routines slowly rebuilt something I'd almost lost. The ability to move through the world as an ordinary person, instead of living as a reminder of someone else's nightmare. Then one Sunday morning, almost 6 months after leaving Millbrook, I woke up and realized something. For the first time in months, I'd slept through the entire night. There had been no yellow curtains, no smoke, no nightmares, just sleep. The dreams still come every now and then, usually when I'm stressed or exhausted. But they don't happen nearly as often anymore. And now I understand what they really are. My therapist helped me realize that my mind wasn't receiving mysterious messages from Eleanor's ghost. It was simply trying to process the trauma of being mistaken for a murderer. Whenever I dream about smoke or fire now, I wake up and remind myself that those images belong to my own fears and anxiety, not to some supernatural connection with a dead woman. I keep a journal beside my bed. Whenever I have one of those dreams, I write it down. Over time, I've noticed they've changed. They're shorter now, less vivid. The house with the yellow curtains still appears sometimes, but it's no longer crystal clear. It's become more like a faded memory than a place I can actually see. My therapist says that's a good sign. It means my mind is slowly letting go of what happened in Millbrook. I still have difficult days. Sometimes I catch my reflection in a mirror and feel disconnected for just a second. Sometimes the dreams seem more real than they should. But those moments are becoming rare. They're no longer my everyday reality. And when they happen, I'm learning to be patient with myself instead of afraid. One Wednesday afternoon, my supervisor called me into her office. She told me she'd been impressed with my work, my reliability, and the quality of everything I did. Then she offered me a promotion to senior customer service representative. The position came with better pay and more flexible hours. I accepted immediately. For the first time in years, I felt proud of myself. The raise meant I could finally afford to move out of my tiny studio apartment. I found a one-bedroom apartment with real windows that filled the rooms with sunlight. After spending a week in apartment hunting, I chose a place on the 3rd floor with a small balcony overlooking a quiet, tree-lined street. Moving this time felt completely different from the day I fled Millbrook. Back then, I'd thrown everything into boxes without thinking. Now I packed carefully. I sorted through my belongings, decided what to keep, what to donate, what no longer belonged in my life. I even bought new furniture instead of relying on secondhand pieces. I chose a bright blue couch. Then I picked out yellow curtains for the living room. Halfway through holding the fabric, I froze. My chest tightened. For a moment, all I could think about was the house from my dreams. Then I smiled, and I bought them anyway. Not because they reminded me of Eleanor, but because this time, they were my choice. I filled the balcony with plants, painted the bedroom walls a soft shade of green, lined the shelves with books, hung photographs of my family and the new friends I'd made. One afternoon, I stood in my living room, sunlight pouring through the yellow curtains I'd chosen for myself. That's when I realized something. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was finally building a real life. My aunt came to visit one Friday afternoon. She took the train from her town, 3 hours away. The moment I opened the door, she wrapped me in a hug. I could feel how relieved she was. She held on for a long time. We spent the afternoon sitting on my balcony, drinking iced tea together. She smiled and told me I looked healthy again. There was color in my face, light in my eyes. We talked about the family resemblance that had caused so much fear and confusion. Now it didn't feel frightening anymore. It was simply genetics. The way certain features repeat from one generation to the next. She pulled out more old family photographs from the genealogy research she'd done. She pointed out my great-grandmother's cheekbones, a distant cousin's eyes, another relative's smile. We laughed about how stubborn our family's genes seemed to be. Generation after generation, the same face kept returning. Eventually she asked whether I still thought about Millbrook. I told her the truth. I did, but not with the same desperate need for answers. We spoke briefly about Eleanor. Then my aunt said something that stayed with me. Some people are simply broken in ways we'll never understand, she said quietly. And that's not our burden to carry. Before she left, she made me promise I'd come visit for Thanksgiving. I agreed without hesitation. I wanted to spend time with people who saw me for who I really was, not as someone else's ghost. A few weeks later, I met someone during book club. Their name was Sam. We were discussing unreliable narrators when Sam joked that every narrator is unreliable because memory itself is a kind of fiction. The comment made me laugh. Something about their smile made me want to keep talking after the meeting ended. We went out for coffee. Soon we discovered we'd both moved to the city within the last year, both looking for fresh starts. When Sam asked about my past, I gave the version I'd practiced with my therapist. I moved here after my divorce. I needed a fresh start. I wanted to build a new life. Everything I said was true. It just wasn't the entire story. Sam understood. They were rebuilding after difficult experiences of their own. I never mentioned Millbrook, or Eleanor, or the cemetery, or the photograph. Those parts of my life belonged to me. I could choose when, or if, I ever shared them. For now, I chose not to. We started meeting every week after book club. Coffee turned into movie nights. Movie nights turned into cooking dinner together. As we got to know each other, Sam asked about my life. I answered honestly about the parts one was ready to share. For the first time, I realized how empowering boundaries could be. Not every chapter of my life had to be told immediately. Some stories could remain private until I was ready. One evening, after dinner at a small restaurant, Sam reached over and took my hand while we walked home. For the first time, I didn't wonder whether they saw Eleanor's face or mine. I simply felt the warmth of their hand in mine, and that was enough. 1 year after leaving Millbrook, I found myself sitting quietly on a Sunday morning, looking back over everything that had changed. I had friends who texted me to make weekend plans, coworkers who invited me out for happy hour, a home that finally felt like my own, and for the first time in a very long while. For the first time in a long while, I truly felt like my life belonged to me again. My relationship with Sam had grown into something steady and meaningful, built on honesty, trust, and mutual respect. I had a job I genuinely enjoyed. My supervisor valued my work, and my opinions mattered during team meetings. I had an apartment that finally felt like home, filled with things I chose because they made me happy, not because they were the cheapest option or all I could afford. Most importantly, I had rediscovered who I was. My identity was no longer tied to Eleanor's crimes, Millbrook's tragedy, or the fact that I happened to share her face. When I introduced myself to new people, I was simply me, a woman with her own story, her own personality, her own flaws and strengths. I could talk about my divorce without feeling ashamed. I could admit I'd struggled financially without feeling embarrassed. I could explain why I chose to start over without feeling like I had to defend my decision. When I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw someone else's ghost. I saw someone who had survived something unbelievably strange and deeply traumatic. Someone who was slowly learning to recognize, and even like, the person staring back. I still went to therapy every other week. I probably would for a while. I still had moments of anxiety, moments of self-doubt, moments where I questioned who I was. But those were normal struggles. They weren't the overwhelming obsession that had once consumed every waking hour of my life. Sometimes I still thought about Eleanor, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come, or whenever another news story about senseless violence appeared on television. I wondered what had happened to her. What kind of pain, what kind of anger, what kind of brokenness could push someone to murder 14 innocent people? But I thought about her differently now, with distance. The same way you might think about any terrible event from history without letting it take over your own life. I'd accepted that I would never know why she did what she did. She carried those answers into the grave when she died alone in those woods. Not knowing no longer made me feel incomplete. There wasn't some missing piece of myself waiting to be discovered through her story. The fact that we looked alike was nothing more than cruel coincidence and genetics. It wasn't fate. It wasn't destiny. And it certainly wasn't some mysterious connection between us. I didn't need to understand Eleanor in order to become whole. Her choices had nothing to do with the person I was, or the person I was becoming. Sometimes I even felt a quiet sadness for her. Not because I excused what she'd done. Nothing could ever excuse that. but because somewhere along the way, she becomes so broken that destruction was the only language she seemed able to speak. Still, that sadness wasn't my burden to carry. I didn't owe anyone an explanation for her actions. I didn't have to spend my life telling her story. I could accept that she existed, accept that she committed terrible crimes, accept that she happened to share my face. Then I could let her rest, wherever she was, with whatever peace or torment had found her in death. That Thanksgiving, my aunt and I sat around her dining room table, surrounded by stacks of genealogy papers. This time, though, we weren't searching for dark secrets or forgotten tragedies. We were looking for the good stories, the ones we'd overlooked. We discovered a great-great-grandfather who had been a music teacher and composed small pieces for local celebrations. We found an aunt who owned a bakery during the Great Depression and quietly fed struggling families for free whenever she could. We learned about a distant cousin who worked as a rural doctor, delivering babies in farmhouses across 3 counties. None of them were famous. None of them changed history. They were simply ordinary people who lived honest lives, worked hard, helped others, and cared for their families. My aunt showed me faded photographs from family reunions in the 1950s. Dozens of smiling faces gathered around picnic tables. Together, we tried to match names with faces. There were farmers, teachers, factory workers, people who paid their bills, raised children, and showed kindness whenever they could. Looking at those photographs, I realized something. This was my real inheritance. Not Eleanor's crimes, not Millbrook's pain, but generations of ordinary people who kept going even when life was difficult. We laughed over the little family traits that seemed to appear in every generation. Apparently, every branch of the family produced at least one terrible cook who insisted on hosting holiday dinners anyway. By the time we finished looking through the old records, I felt connected to something much bigger than myself. Not in a frightening way, in a comforting one. One evening, while Sam and I were cooking dinner together, they noticed the small scar above my left eyebrow. They reached up and gently brushed it with their thumb. "How did you get this?" they asked. For the first time, I told the real story. My story, the one that belonged only to me. When I was 7, I said, smiling a little, I was climbing a tree in my grandmother's backyard. She'd already told me it was too tall. I climbed it anyway. I slipped, hit my head on a branch while I was falling, and ended up needing 3 stitches. My grandmother rushed me to the emergency room. It was terrifying at the time, but now, it's just one small scar from my own childhood. A scar that had nothing to do with Eleanor, nothing to do with Millbrook, nothing to do with anyone else's story. It was mine, just like the life I was finally learning to live. I remember being far more upset that I wasn't allowed to climb the tree any more than I was about the pain. My grandmother bought me ice cream afterward to make the scary trip to the hospital a little easier. Sam smiles while listening and laughs softly. "That sounds exactly like you," they say, ignoring every warning because the tree looked worth climbing. Then they lean over, kiss the small scar above my eyebrow, and we go back to chopping vegetables for dinner. It's a tiny moment, simple, ordinary, but it means more to me than I can explain. For the first time, I realized that scar belongs entirely to me, not to Eleanor. It's been on my face since I was 7 years old, long before Eleanor probably even existed under that name. It belongs to my childhood, to my grandmother, to scraped knees, tree climbing, 3 stitches, and melting ice cream after a frightening afternoon in the emergency room. Maybe Eleanor had the exact same scar. Maybe that's why it appeared in the photograph on her grave. But she doesn't get to claim this part of me. This scar is mine. It was earned through childhood recklessness and healed with family love. No resemblance to a dead woman can ever take that away. One Saturday afternoon, while I was folding laundry, a thought came to me so clearly it almost stopped me in my tracks. Identity isn't something other people assign to us. It isn't inherited through genetics, bone structure, or the face we're born with. It's something we build, choice by choice, relationship by relationship, day after day. It's created through the people we love, the work we choose to do, the kindness we show, the mistakes we learn from, the way we spend the limited time we're given. Over the past year, I've been quietly building my own identity. Every therapy session, every book club meeting, every pottery class, every conversation with Sam. Every morning, I chose to get out of bed instead of hiding from the world. Every time I introduced myself to someone new despite my fear. Every difficult step forward. Those choices shaped the person I was becoming. My life wasn't defined by my divorce, or by losing my home, or by looking like Eleanor Price. It was defined by how I responded to those things. By choosing to keep going when giving up would have been easier. By allowing myself to trust people again. By being brave enough to build new friendships. To fall in love again. Eleanor and I may have shared a face, but we were never the same person because we made completely different choices. She chose destruction. I'm choosing to build, piece by piece, day by day, creating a life from the wreckage of the hardest year I've ever lived through. Sometimes, while I'm making dinner or folding laundry or doing any of the ordinary little things that make up a normal life, I still think about Eleanor. I wonder if she ever had quiet moments like these. Moments filled with peace instead of darkness. I wonder if there was a time before everything fell apart. Before whatever happened to her turned her into someone capable of destroying so many innocent lives. Maybe somewhere along the way, she lost herself. Maybe she forgot how to build an identity through ordinary choices the way I'm learning to do now. Maybe that loss became so overwhelming that violence felt like the only way to matter. The only way to be remembered. I'll never know, and that's okay. Therapy taught me something I desperately needed to learn. Empathy doesn't require complete understanding. I can feel sadness for Eleanor without knowing exactly what broke inside her. I can acknowledge that she suffered in ways I'll never fully understand. And at the same time, I can recognize that her suffering never excuses what she did to those 14 innocent people and their families. Both of those truths can exist together. Neither cancels out the other. Accepting that finally allowed me to let go of the obsession that almost consumed me. Now, when I look into a mirror, I see myself, not Eleanor's ghost. The resemblance is still there. The same face, the same bone structure, the same features that caused so much fear in Millbrook. But they don't define me anymore. When I think about that town now, I feel the same quiet sadness I'd feel for any tragedy. Like reading about a terrible disaster in the news. You mourn the people who suffered. You wish it had never happened. But you also understand it isn't your burden to carry forever. The obsession that once ruled my life has become just another chapter in my story. A strange, painful chapter. But only one chapter. Not the whole book. Today, I'm happy. Not because life became perfect, but because I worked for this happiness. Through therapy. Through difficult conversations. Through painful healing, through choosing over and over again to keep moving forward when it would have been easier to stop trying. I've learned that we don't always get answers. Sometimes terrible things happen for reasons we'll never understand. But even when we don't get answers, we still get choices. And every day, I'm choosing to build something good. That's the life I've chosen. Now I'd love to hear what you think. Do you agree with my perspective? Or do you see it differently? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious to hear your opinion.